I think we should go ahead and start because I would like to quickly ask you guys who you are before we start, and we can do that, and then if anybody else comes in, that will work. I'm going to apologize to the post-production guy who's recording this because most of what's going to happen right now probably won't. I'm not going to try to repeat it all. I might summarize. I may summarize a few of the quick points afterwards that I get from you. I'd like to hear just quickly who you are, where you're from, and where you get your information about Drupal, your favorite source, and if you have contributed to Drupal documentation before, if not, why not? And we're a small enough group that I think we have time to do that. So you just start right up front.
Okay, I'm Roy Francis. I'm from Indianapolis. I'm kind of a newbie Drupal user. I mostly search drupal.org for information, and I think I've already thought about that there could be a role in contributing to documentation.
Well, there is. Okay. So nothing stopped you yet other than you didn't know.
Yeah.
I'm Dan DeGrazia. I'm from here in Chicago. I work for Lingotech, which is a partner organization doing translation. I am 33 days into that organization and about 20 days into Drupal. So my favorite sources are just about everything. Right? I haven't even distinguished yet. Talking to people's working best. It's interesting, your last question is actually the question that I'm sort of here to understand. Because I'm looking at how to get involved, and contribute. And since I'm really not going to be coding up in Drupal for a little while, contributing on the doc side seems interesting. And so I want to know what prevents people from doing it and how people do it and things like that. So that's what I'm doing.
Good. I hope this will be helpful for you.
I'm Jake Anakin. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and next month I'm starting at Madison Public Library as the web developer. My favorite sources, other than like kind of the official module documentation, are people's YouTube videos of them actually doing something and talking through it, or like people's blog posts about going through all of the exact details and settings that they've done on a particular project. And I've contributed just a couple things to a few modules for documentation, like just a couple paragraphs. Great.
I'm Liz Trudeau. I work for the Drupal Association, and I am one of the folks that helps in support. So people that start up their account on drupal.org, if they have trouble, I probably get that email. And I haven't contributed specifically to Drupal documentation. I end up doing Drupal.org documentation, so specific to the website. And most of what I do is sort of like, oh, this needs updating, and I know what it is, so I fix it, or band-aid.
Okay.
I'm from in Chicago. I work for Ellen, and I've been doing Drupal for a few months, probably about 6 years. I normally start with Google, and so from there, we're going to figure out how to do something that I want to do. And I don't know much about doing Drupal documentation, but I'm a person.
Joe Mahalik from Indiana, Northwest area. Usually Google as well. Just, do Drupal and then search for what I'm looking for. Which usually takes you to drupal.org, and then have a couple other options to work with as well. And then that's why I'm here to learn about documentation.
I'm Susan Conrad. I'm here in the Chicago area. My favorite source for information so far has been Kathy Days. Kathy brought me into work on the project. She had no computer background at all. And certainly, yes, Google is my friend. I'm just now starting to get into the point where I'm looking beyond that and looking for other ways to participate. And I don't think I'm ready to give anything back, but yes, maybe documentation would be a way to participate.
We'll try to challenge this.
Hi, I'm Doug Knapp. I'm from Chicago, and I work for the Illinois State Bar. My role is like a project manager, basically. So possibly give up or give back. Sorry, Freudian slips all over. Although I think what has prevented me in the past from doing that is, just learning like what I would give would be correct or good enough. And I guess for a favorite source of information, apart from Drupal's main website, there's a weekly Drupal newsletter.
Sure.
And in the past, I've also used some inhibits.
Good.
Bob Snodgrass from St. Charles, Illinois. And I guess my favorite source of information is usually I'm looking for specific answers to specific questions. So Googling those things, and I'm looking for the resources like drupal.org or Stack Overflow or Lullabot or Build a Module, those kinds of things that come out. Because those have been pretty much the best sources I found. What prevents me from contributing on the documentation front is that I'm involved in user groups and just day-to-day stuff. Too much time on other things.
Sure. More questions?
Yeah, Kevin Pastor, former Indianapolis, currently in St. Louis, soon to be Indianapolis again. So, favorite source, I Google everything. Usually Drupal.org comes up top of the list, and that's where I get most of my answers from. That's a good contribution. Time typically. I'm a single person shop, so I'm doing everything where it is, trying to do all the work, and it's difficult to come up with that.
Sure. So, how many people in here have edited? Anybody in here edited a Drupal.org doc? And I am thinking about the documentation. Primarily today, I'm going to be talking a lot about the documentation on Drupal.org for Drupal. There are other forms of documentation. We'll mention that. Well, we'll talk about a few different kinds of ways you can contribute to documentation. My experience is not a lot, and I won't be talking too much today in the kinds of documentation that sometimes coders think about in terms of coding, documenting APIs and stuff like that. And I think you'll all be happy with that, because I don't think anybody here came here with the intention of like documenting APIs from what your introductions were, right? So, quick information about me. I used to spend a lot of time doing online citizen engagement. I've been dabbling in website development and stuff pretty much most of my life, but I really began to focus. A couple years ago, I had a brief foray into restaurant ownership. Owned a Chinese restaurant for a year. And it was after that I was kind of transitioning back, looking for, okay, what am I going to do next? With some experience in web development design, some exposure to Drupal, friends doing Drupal, I decided to really put my time and effort focusing there. So I just dove back full-time into Drupal about 3 years ago. Did freelance work for a couple of years. Last year formed a company called Triplo with my colleagues Barry and David Needham. Triplo is just a small design firm, but we really focus on trying to work with community training, working with other freelancers, doing training, mentoring, and support. I got into Drupal partly because of the community. I'm very interested in community. I want to be a part of the community and give back. I've been to quite a few code sprints, and like a lot of you, I'm not a coder, I'm not a developer. I can get in and I do a lot of site building and theming. I can get in and hack a module. I have written 1 or 2 custom modules for clients that are like 15 lines each and do very simple things, but I don't claim to be a real advanced coder. But I do want to contribute back to the community, and at like one of my very first Drupal camps, somebody got up front and gave a big speech about how everybody should come to the sprint tomorrow, everybody has something to offer, even if you don't know how to code, you can work on documentation, you can work on other things, and please come. And sort of at the last minute on Saturday evening, I decided, what the heck, I'll go to the sprint tomorrow. not really sure what I was going to get into. I find that while that is said a lot, and I've been to several sprints, in fact, I've helped organize a few sprints myself, and that when we talk a lot about all the different ways that people can contribute to Drupal, so often you end up at the sprint and everybody's coding or working on patches and things like that. And this isn't exclusively true, but it's the thrust is there, and I've kind of felt like, and I've talked to other people who heard that promise, like there's a lot of different things we could do, but they get to the sprint and they don't feel like there's a lot of support there for like going off and doing documentation. So one of the things I've been trying to do over the last year is, one, just get more familiar with documentation in Drupal, on drupal.org and for Drupal, and also look at ways to get more people involved, particularly at sprints and other face-to-face events, but also, you know, in your sort of day-to-day work. Some of the key points that I want to stress today are that good documentation is a really important part of the Drupal community. A lot of people who come and look at a piece of software like Drupal or WordPress or something will look at the document. You know, if they're beginning and they're not finding answers to the questions they have, they may get frustrated and go away. The better documentation we have, the more likely we are to keep people engaged and keep them in the community. I think certainly in terms of contributing to Drupal, if we provide folks like you folks in the room with opportunities to do something that you feel like you can do and you can actually effectively contribute something to the community, we're more likely to also keep you involved, and you know, maybe someday you'll move on to do other things as well. And we should do that. I also want to talk about the different kinds of documentation in different levels. There are I'm taking a pretty broad view of documentation, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Yeah, that all of us can and contribute to Drupal documentation. Web-chick, Angie Byron, has a blog post she did a few years ago about documenting your way to better knowledge of Drupal. And one of her points is that we need beginners and people who don't understand Drupal helping with documentation, because you understand what's missing from the documentation. One of the huge failures I see in a lot of Drupal documentation is it's written by people who understand things so well that they leave out things that are really important to me because they don't. It's so obvious to them, it doesn't occur to them that it's missing. When you guys are looking, a lot of you in the room are looking at documentation, you're going to see those holes, and you have the opportunity to help fix those and make our documentation better. So I want to personalize this a little bit and talk about my own experience as I sort of got into this. And when I first started thinking about how I could contribute to documentation, and I was working on a website called worklatte.com. It was my a side project I was doing for myself, and it involved documenting all the creating a database of coffee shops in the Twin Cities area that were good to work at. And I was evaluating them based not on the quality of their coffee, but on their workability. How many outlets they had, do they have sufficient tables? Because I was a freelancer at the time, and I spent a lot of my time working in coffee shops. And it seemed like, well, if I'm going to do this, they need to be on a map. And what I want is for people to be able to type in an address and say, show me some coffee shops around that address, and that I could work at. And so I had to create this particular functionality, which was a proximity search, and it sort of led to the open layer search. And I found this page on drupal.org that documented that process. This page, I'm not trying to go live and actually show you the pages. We're going to look at a lot of screenshots today. This page actually has about 12 sections with maybe 8 or 10 steps in each section to set this up. It's a fairly complicated process. And as I started to work through that, I started to realize that some things had changed, some things were just difficult to understand, and that maybe I could do something to improve this. Like some of you, I was still new, and I thought, well, but I don't know a lot about this, right? And what if I'm wrong? What if I edit this and I put something in there that isn't right? I also was very concerned because this was written, I underlined some lines. I went back and took a screenshot of what this was before I edited it. And the first line is, I started this project. That was the person who had written this blog post as part of a project. And then you go down the attempt to build a website, There's two more I statements. I decided to stay in the middle, and more by accident. I work with open layers. I guess I followed open layers because I wanted to do this without Google. And as I thought about editing this, I thought, this is this guy's personal story. What business do I have editing his personal case study about how he did this? But then I thought, what else would I do? Create a new page that with my case study on it? Or I actually, as I was working on this project, and as I was hesitant to push that edit button, for quite a while I debated whether or not I should do that or how I should do it. And I, at some point, started looking around for help on drupal.org that would help me figure out what it is I can and should do and how I should do it. And that wasn't very helpful either, trying to find those documents. I finally, and I took a picture of the log here on December 8th, 2013, got up the courage to go in and do an edit and updated the module, the required list of modules, because that wasn't up to date. I went on and made quite a few edits to that page. At some point I just realized, you know what, leaving this page here with this guy's personal story on how he created the site that doesn't work anymore isn't doing anybody any good. And then once I started to edit it, I realized, you know what, it's fine that he started to write this as a personal thing, but now I'm contributing to it. It's not really about his story, it's about how to accomplish this task. So I eventually sort of got up the nerve to just start crossing out some of those personal statements about I did X and I did Y. And it was a little easier to do that knowing that there was a history here. And if anybody came back a week or a month later and said, what the heck was he doing? It could all be reverted anyways. It wasn't like I was destroying anybody's work. The guy who started this, all of his stuff, I just went back and took a screenshot of it yesterday. It's all still available. So anybody who wants to go back and look at the history of this page is certainly that they can still do it. I mean, if I felt like I were permanently destroying what somebody else had done, that would be even more scary. But once I realized, this is, I honestly believe it's going to make the page better. It's going to help the next person. It just became, and that if I make a mistake, somebody else can fix it. The history's there. It became a lot easier. And I went ahead and made that step. So I include the screenshot, not just to show the date of my first commit, but to show you that knowing that's all there, that history is there, can be a little bit freeing in terms of actually doing your first edit. Since my first edit, since I made a bunch of changes on there, I did about 6 months or a year later, I was doing a presentation on the same topic, and I went back and was walking through those steps. In doing that, I downloaded updated versions of some of those modules and found out that the interface had changed on some of those modules that was in this process, and the instructions no longer applied. And now I was already within 6 months, I was already editing the edits that I had made and updating them. And that's not uncommon. At one point, I went back to this page, and somebody had changed it and recommended using a different module. And I went to that module, and on the top of that module, it said, we recommend you don't use this module. So it was pretty straightforward to me that was not a good decision. I went back and changed it. And I made a note saying that the author of the module that was being recommended recommends not using this module. So it didn't make sense. What we're looking at on the right-hand side, this I just saw today or yesterday for the first time, is actually somebody's added a comment sort of documenting a whole variation of this, which is great, but they put it in as one of the comments underneath there. And we're going to come back and talk to that in a minute, because one of the things in my exploration of documentation and what you can and some easy ways you can help with documentation I've learned is that one of the tasks you can do is go through and take things like this that people put in the comments, edit the move that up into the document. Or, in this case, I haven't looked at it close enough. It might make sense to turn this into a new page because it might be different enough. If it's a completely different approach, I might create a new page. If it's really an update on what I was doing, then I might change my page. But I've come to documentation pages before where there's 40 or 50 comments, and sometimes on comment 23 is some really useful information. That's not a good way to store that information. And what we can do as users of drupal.org and contributors is we can go down to those comments, bring them up, edit the document to reflect the good information, and then we can go to the Drupal documentation issues queue. How many people knew there was a Drupal documentation issues queue? Anybody? One person. Almost anybody I tell that is like, oh, wow, I didn't know there was a Drupal documentation issues queue. You can go to the Drupal documentation issues queue and you can ask to have these comments then removed because they're no longer necessary. You've updated the page to reflect the comments, and now future people aren't going to have to read through 20 comments to find that little nugget of information. My final comment was about this is that this page, not this comment here, but the page that I've been working on off and on over the last year, I know it's still out of date. I told you it was like 12 sections with 10 points each. Every time I've sat down to document that, to sort of update it, I've never gotten all the way through and sort of updated every section. And so there are sections of that I know I just haven't had a chance to get to myself. And also I'm pretty sure that there's probably, OpenLayers is a fast-paced developing module. It seems and there's probably been some changes that need to be updated. So, it isn't about, this wasn't a case where it's just sort of a quick fix this thing and you're done. In the back of my mind, I've had this idea about, sort of adopting this page. It's just one that I will try to keep up. I've not done a great job so far. If anybody wants to help me, that would be great. A lot of pages aren't this, a lot of the documentation on drupal.org isn't this complicated. I think the other thing, just sort of talking about documentation on drupal.org, this isn't so much documenting like a module, it's more like a recipe. And I think, I've had a lot of conversations with people about what could be done to improve documentation on drupal.org, and I think some people would argue that maybe this doesn't belong here at all. Maybe this should be a blog post somewhere describing this. Maybe we should keep drupal.org, partly because of what I'm just talking about, because it's sort of a recipe that changes all the time, and maybe drupal.org should be focused on documenting modules, individual modules and how they work, as opposed to various, I could probably come up with 15 different case studies like this, of different things I could do with OpenLayers. And should we really be trying to create all that, document all of that on drupal.org where it then has to be maintained and updated? So one of my points is that documentation is important and that you can do it. Another is that you should do it. And the obvious reason that several people mentioned is this is one way they view that they can give back to the community. But I think it's worth thinking about why you should do this a little bit more than that. Really, I think the number one reason that a lot of people do documentation is to self-document knowledge for themselves. Okay, that benefits us all, but it was part of my motivation is that I knew I wasn't, when I went through those instructions for that OpenLayers recipe, in a sense, I knew that the next time I was going to have to build that on the site, I wasn't going to remember all of that. And if there were errors in it, I was going to run into those same errors again. So by fixing that, I'm fixing it for the next time I come back to it. I've talked to any number of people who have written blog posts about, how they did something. My friend Wilbur was just telling me, one point he wrote a blog post about how to do something. 2 years later, he forgot he'd written the blog post, Googled that issue, and got his own blog post about how to do that. I have run into that myself in issues queues where I've written something I did in an issue as a response in an issue queue, come back later and found my own comments in the issue queue, and a number of developers have told me that. I think that happens to developers all the time, that they're going back looking for the solution to a problem and realized they commented on it 9 months ago and actually left the solution for themselves and for other people. Certainly, contributing to documentation is a way to, often they say a great way to learn something is to teach it, to explain it to somebody else. When you take the time to document something you've learned, you are reinforcing and strengthening your own knowledge of that. It's much more likely something you're going to remember, and you're going to know it better because you've taken the time to do that. It certainly builds your reputation in the community. By the way, some of these points, I think most of these were stolen from the documentation on drupal.org. Gained experience in technical writing and editing. Certainly, if that's an interest of yours, it's something you can do. And then, of course, the one I started with, which is just to give back to the Drupal community. If you're looking for a way that you can give to the Drupal community and you don't feel like you can do it in code and other places, documentation might be the place for you. And there's certainly a lot of work to be done there. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm not thinking about documentation sort of too narrowly. I looked up a definition. The usually printed instructions, comments, and software for using a particular piece or system of computer software or hardware. For me, I'm thinking about not so much printed, but written. And written in more than, I don't want us to limit ourselves to drupal.org. Because as we were going around the room and talking about, most of us start at Google, right? And we Google a problem. And there's two places that, I don't know, depending on what kinds of problems you're Googling, it will depend on where you end up. But I often end up either at drupal.org or at Drupal Answers on Stack Exchange, or if it's like a get question on just Stack Exchange. But there are other places you also might end up on blogs, other things. For me, any place that you can, that you're writing out and putting information that's findable by Google is valuable. So whether or not you actually click the edit button on drupal.org isn't critical. What's most important is that you're documenting what you're doing and writing it somewhere. Issues queue, and I'm jumping ahead here. I'm actually going to list those out in a minute, but there's a lot of different places to do that. What we're not talking about today is sort of the old school documentation. When was the last time, or has anybody referred to a Drupal book in the last 6 months? One person? When I first started doing Drupal, I went to Drupal books, right? But I haven't cracked a Drupal book in probably over 2 years. I think Drupal books still have a place, but it's a pretty static way of storing information in a field that's changing dynamically. And it's also not so relevant to this conversation because probably most of us aren't equipped to write books. So I know I have met people who have written Drupal books and are in the process of writing Drupal books for Drupal 8. It's still an important thing and should be done, but we're going to kind of skip over that. It's certainly an important form of Drupal documentation, but not one that we're going to talk about. Some of the different kinds, and I sort of cheated and jumped ahead here, some of the different ways that we can document what it is we're learning. The most obvious one is the official documentation on drupal.org. And I don't know if I should use that word official, but there is the whole community docs on drupal.org that describes, we're going to see some pictures of it later. Well, we got a section on understanding Drupal, the installation guide, structure guide, site building. So there's a number of different sections targeted at different activities within Drupal. One of my criticisms of drupal.org is that trying to find something by navigating that structure is almost impossible. There are documentation pages that I know about in drupal.org and have tried to get back to using this structure, and I can never find them. You just got to go Google them, and Google will take you right to them. But because most of us are using Google anyways, maybe that's not a big deal, right? Most of us aren't going to drupal.org and browsing through the structure to try and find an answer. And I think if you are, my recommendation is forget it. You're going to frustrate yourself. I think that there is work being done on drupal.org to address these issues. There is a Drupal documentations working group that is looking structurally at how docs are set up and organized and what can be done in the future. And I'm hoping they come up with some great ideas. I know they have great ideas. I'm hoping that they can do something about them. But in the meantime, we have what we have, and we need to work with it. When I first started thinking about encouraging people to contribute to Drupal docs, I had second thoughts about it because I wasn't sure I wanted to encourage people to contribute to something that was sort of as disorganized as it sometimes feels or is potentially unuseful. I mean, there's a lot of things about drupal.org that I really don't like. And it was like, do I really want to be going out and evangelizing that people should spend their time contributing to a documentation structure that's really cumbersome to use, not very visually attractive, sometimes hard to navigate. I think over time I've seen improvements in drupal.org. It's slow, it's incremental. Things haven't gotten a lot better in the last year, but they have gotten better. I've also found that, by contributing back myself, when I first went to the documentation about how to contribute to Drupal documentation, I couldn't find anything. As soon as I started making some comments about it, editing some of it myself, and over the course of the last year, I feel like that documentation has actually improved quite a bit, and that makes me feel better about this process, that I can actually see progress and see it improving. Now, some of it might be that I'm just more knowledgeable about it, right, what I talked about earlier, and now I'm not seeing the holes as much as I used to because I figured out where things are, and that's where more fresh eyes are helpful. If you're going into these documents for the first time and having the same problems I used to, that's a problem. And you can help us by telling us about those problems and helping us fix them. So to just sort of casually talk about some of the other ways things are documented that you can actually have contribute to. We also have documentation in code, and I'm not talking about necessarily like this hardcore documentation of APIs and stuff, but anybody who's ever used a theme like Zen that's specifically been sent up with extensive documentation in the code, you can really learn a lot. I mean, if you're trying to learn how to build a theme from scratch, the Zen theme does a lot to help you right in the code. You open up the files and you start reading through the codes. This is an example of the info file, and most everything outlined in red is documentation. It isn't just opening up code and having to edit it. It's written there to help you learn how to do a Drupal theme, in particular how to use Drupal. So you can actually find in the code really great documentation. And I think sometimes we don't think to look there, but we should, especially once you get to that stage where you're going to start going into the code. I think most programmers would say, and I'm not really one that, good programmer, one of the skills of a good programmer is documenting their code, so that a guy was just telling me the other night that it's really important that he document his code for himself, because he said, if I come back 6 months later and look at my code, I don't remember why I did it, let alone expect somebody else to do it. So getting documentation into the code is important. Theming, not many of us in the room are coders. Some of us might be themers, and in a theme file, that's a place we can be sure to add documentation, document what we've done and what we've learned. The issues queues, I've already mentioned this. One of my mentors and business partners, David Needham, is always telling me, I've got an issue, and I'll ask him how to do something. I don't know, go look it up in the issues queue. I look it up in the issues queue, I solved my problem. I say, hey David, I solved my problem. And he says, well, did you go back and document that in the issues queue? Did you let people know that their solution solved your problem? Or if it didn't solve your problem, did you report that? And I'm trying to get better at that, and I've done some of that. And again, that's one of those places where I'm most likely to come back. When I have done that, it has on occasion come back to help me myself as I come back to an issue, the same issue 6 months later. So I think a lot of people feel like, especially beginners, feel like the issues queue is for the people that are fixing issues, but people who are reporting and updating on issues are also really welcome in the issues queue. And you should make the issue queue your friend. Report back what you've learned, what your feedback on issues, did the solution that somebody provided work for you, didn't it? One of the things you can do in the issue, sometimes in an issue, there'll be an issue in the issues queue, and I've read through it, there might be 30 comments, and over the course of those 30 comments, 4 or 5 different solutions are proposed. And for each one has worked for somebody, but then somebody else comes along and says, it didn't work for me, so try this. In this case, and I think I've done this at least once, somebody went back, I'm looking ahead a slide, the one you can't see. In this case, somebody went back and edited the issue summary for the issue, and they summarized the 5 possible solutions that various people had recommended through the comments. So it's right there at the front. So somebody who's arriving at that site today doesn't have to read through 30 comments to find where the answer is. They can look at that summary. And we should all feel empowered to do something like this. If you're digging through an issue summary like this, trying to find a solution to a problem, and they're scattered throughout the comments, it's a very useful thing. You're helping people out if you go ahead. I think you weren't raising your hand, but if anybody does want to have a question or a comment, feel free to jump in at any time. Has anybody ever done something like this? Or
on the drive here, I was griping about my Drupal complaints, and this was at the top of my list. I don't know how much time I waste reading through all the comments to figure out the solution.
Right. So having somebody go through and summarize that is really...
Every once in a while, you come across something where somebody took time and it saved me 15 minutes.
Yeah. And it's a couple of you mentioned the obstacle you have in contributing is time, and this does take time. And so that, it's like I do have to carve out once in a while some time and say, I'm just going to do something, something like this. Or sometimes the issue is just that important to me that it's like like I say, I'm going to come back to it myself, or it was that important to me that I feel obligated to sort of help the next person because this is a really big thing. If it's an issue that I feel less strongly about or is less important to me, it's a little harder to make that time, but we need to from time to time.
Is there any standards out there distinguishing this is a site builder solution and this is a developer solution? That's one of the things I always thought would be useful in documentation. Here are the 4 solutions if you're a site builder, and here are the 3 solutions if you're a developer, because you come across it and it's like, now go into here and here and here, put this code and do that.
Right.
And then you find out later that if you spend an extra 10 minutes searching, there's a module for that.
Right.
It might like put a little bit more overhead on your website, but boy, I got that fixed in 5 minutes.
I think the actual Drupal documentation does a better job of sort of segmenting out the kinds of documentation that's going to be useful for developers from the kind of documentation that's useful for site builders. When you're in the issues queue like this, oftentimes that list of solutions are really kind of workarounds, right? It's like maybe there's a bug or something that the module doesn't do that a number of people want to do, and there's 2 different kind of discussions that can happen, right? One is a developer discussion, which is how do we make the module do that, writing a patch, getting it committed. The other is, oh, here's how I got around that, right? I'm not a developer, so when I get into an issues queue and find a problem maybe that hasn't been solved, I'm not likely the guy who's going to write a patch that's going to fix it, but I might be the guy who finds, a temporary solution. Or maybe it's not a temporary solution. Maybe it's a perfectly acceptable solution that just hadn't occurred to me at first, and I can go back and document that, right? And that's more of a site builder solution. In terms of whether there's any kind of like standards on how to do that or separate it, I don't think so. I think particularly in the issues queue, that stuff is all going to be intermingled. I don't know that there's a particular way to distinguish that. And I think it'll be kind of obvious, that the site builder solutions are the ones that involve going in and changing configuration, right? And if somebody's writing a patch, that's less helpful to me. Although, certainly I am certainly skilled enough that I have applied patches from the issues queue or just edited code directly based on comments in the issues queue. Any other comments or thoughts? Anybody ever had some experiences you want to share in relation to anything we've talked about so far? I'd love to hear your own stories with documentation, things that you wish you'd have found, or that, if you've tried something. Has anybody ever tried to edit a page or participate in the issues queue and had a negative experience? That's good to see, because a lot of us are afraid sometimes to post in the issues queue because we're afraid somebody's going to make fun of us. And once in a while somebody does, but most of the time they don't. And so I try not to promise you that nobody's ever going to say anything nasty to you, but you just can't worry about that. And I think you'll find that if somebody does, that somebody else will say something nice and be supportive, because 99% of my interactions and responses have been very positive. And the ones that, and some of them are very constructive, right? Somebody will say, well, you probably should have dealt with this over here. And that's perfectly acceptable too. So
I find myself far more willing to leave some kind of tip or something on Stack Exchange than drupal.org, because I'm kind of like worried about my reputation.
Okay.
Because it keeps a log of like all the things you've done, and if somebody's like, "Whoa, I work with this guy," 90% of the time he comments, he's an idiot.
Sure.
But if I do a Stack Exchange, it's a totally different username. Nobody knows that's me over there. So tips and things.
Create a separate Drupal org.
Because this is being recorded, I'm going to repeat what you just said real quickly, which is that you sometimes prefer to do things in Stack Exchange instead of drupal.org to sort of, because of reputation. Of course, one of my responses is, of course, on Stack Exchange it's there too, right? It's just, I assume your thought is that it's less obvious.
It's not my community.
Right, Stack Exchange is a way. Although, on Drupal Answers, there are a lot of the same people. One of my very early experiences at a sort of being involved in the Drupal community, the presenter got up and said, you know what, I don't use drupal.org, I use Stack Exchange. That's where I really get my best quality information. And it's certainly true that certain types of questions, I think I do get to, you generally find better answers there. Everybody familiar with Drupal Answers? On the Stack Exchange? Anybody not familiar? Raise your hand if you're not. Okay. So you don't know what the Stack Exchange is? Okay. Stack Exchange is just another website that has all kinds of different sections and most of them technical, although they branched off into other non-technical areas as well. It's a question and answer place. You can post questions. It's kind of unique in that it's been gamified in a way that you can vote on other people's answers. So, there particularly on really broad questions like a GET question. If I have a question about using GET, I might end up with the same question in a Stack Exchange with 40 different answers, but people have voted on the best one, so that floats to the top. And then you get points if your answer gets selected, and so you can build up a reputation that way. And there's a section in the Stack Exchange for just Drupal. It's called Drupal Answers. And it's a great place to get answers for more technical questions. I've almost not at all mentioned Drupal forums today, and I probably won't, because Drupal forums there is a lot of activity, and there are people that spend a lot of time there answering and asking questions, but I almost never end up there when I Google a question. I mean, that almost never comes up as the place to get the answer, and I've had better success at getting good answers in Stack Exchange. But I would never discourage anybody from using Drupal.org forums. But, and I think there's a lot of debate about whether or not, some people have proposed that Drupal.org drop its forums altogether and just rely on something like Drupal Answers. Other people say we should make Drupal forums more like Stack Exchange so that people use it more. I'm going to stay out of that debate, but just make you aware of those. Was there another question or comment? Yep.
I think one of the challenges with documentation is documentation is a general purpose, right? You're going to talk about X, right? So let's face it, developers, 90% of the time, probably more, we are looking for point solution. I don't know if you've ever had a friend who said, would you like me to explain to you how this works, or do you want me to just give you the solution? You're like, no, just give me the solution. I don't want to know how it works. I'm under deadline. Just solve this for me kind of thing. And don't give me the philosophical background of where it came from. And I think that, I don't know if there's anything that can be done there other than properly manage expectation. Because I think you're absolutely right. You said earlier, you have a question, you want an answer. That's kind of different than documentation, and I'm not sure that there's anything necessarily that can be done about that.
Right.
Because I don't know what your problem is when I'm writing the documentation. So it's sort of like, these are all the things you could do with this particular module or section of it.
Right.
And you're right, Stack is an awesome place. X is happening. They're like, oh, wait a minute, it'll be fine.
Right. So the point that was just made is that developers are often looking for an answer to their specific question, right? Not the kind of general information that you'll find in documentation. And I think that's true. And this is making a distinction between sort of a question and answer and documentation. It's kind of why I'm lumping them together a bit. I think you're providing a valuable contribution to the community by answering those questions and getting your answers in writing, whether or not it's in a more traditional sort of documentation sector.
Your slide. This is a great slide. This is, a summary one. That's almost sort of a genius thing to do. We're about to go into 15 pages of documentation. So here are 5 things. You may not want to read all 15 pages.
So.
It's a cool.
Yeah. Right. So anything that you can put in writing that's going to help yourself or other people in the future, I think is valuable, and I think can all be in some ways lumped back into that area of documentation. And if answering questions, and another point we haven't talked about here, if you ask a question like in the issues queue or on Stack Exchange, nobody answers it. You figure out the answer. Go back and answer your own question. Okay, you're going to appreciate it later, and other people will as well. Don't leave your question unanswered. I have 1 or 2 questions out there that I've left unanswered that I feel guilty about, I lose sleep about, but I try to do that quite a bit. So, any other questions or comments at this stage? So we've obviously covered this. This is the whole other area, like Drupal Answers. And I should I'll mention the Drupal forums again, same way. Drupal forums is a place to find answers, but depending on what your questions are, I think. So here's just a quick, I threw in a screenshot of the Drupal Answers on Stack Exchange. You'll notice It's probably hard to see, but there's like, I've got 36, I don't answer a lot of questions. There's people with 10,000 points on Stack Exchange because they answer lots of questions. Mostly I have asked questions and answered a few of my own questions. And I don't think you get points for answering your own question. You get them for answering other people's. I've tried to go there and answer other people's questions, but most of them I didn't have the answer for. So, but fortunately there are really smart people who are willing to help you out there. So another area where a lot of this happens, it's been mentioned before, is Drupal blogs. I mentioned Drupal Planet because Drupal Planet is how many people are, who's not familiar? Anybody not familiar with Drupal Planet? Okay, so Drupal Planet is a page on drupal.org. Let me go ahead and scoot over to the next slide because here's just a screenshot of it. It's Drupal Planet, or drupal.org/planet. And it's just an RSS feed of a bunch of blogs that talk about Drupal. And if you blog about Drupal, you can ask to get your blog included in the Drupal Planet RSS feed. You just have to make sure that you're only tagging the blog posts that are relevant to Drupal. If you happen to blog about your family reunion, they don't want it showing up on Drupal.org or on the Drupal Planet. But you can set your blog up in a way that it will, through tags, it will only the appropriate blog posts will show up. And it's a great place for keeping up on, I don't know how many. You can start to see the list on the right-hand side here, and that's just the A's for the blogs. So there's a long list of blogs that are in this. A lot of them, though, are inactive. You can't probably worthless to try to keep up with all of them, but I think if you every once in a while go to the Drupal Planet, you're going to find something of interest to you. And so it's just it's like what Google Reader used to be, except it's a curated list of Drupal posts. There was a blog post. This is, I'm looking at the date back in September 21st, 2013. I don't know Bryan Braun. I heard about this blog post on Twitter and I thought it was really interesting. He said, please stop brewing and start blogging about Drupal. And I would say start editing drupal.org as well, but his point, he says, it's so important that you take the thing you just figured out, copy and paste it into a body field, and click publish. That most of us are doing our searching through Google, right? So we might get taken to drupal.org, we might get taken to the Stack Exchange, we might also get taken to somebody's personal blog. So if you're not comfortable posting something on drupal.org, or maybe it's not appropriate there because maybe it's related to Drupal development, but not specific enough that it belongs on drupal.org, go ahead and post it on a blog. Just get it out there, and the good stuff is going to rise to the top, or generally does. It probably doesn't always. He goes on to say, I went the wrong way. He goes on to say, we need more voices, we need more diverse voices. We need voices from the Southern Hemisphere. We need voices that worry that their English isn't good enough. We need the voices of people who just started out feeling slow and stupid. You learned where the log out button was? Cool, tell us about it. You made a mistake and blew up your site. Bummer, tell us about it. Whatever you're working on, I want you to tell us about it, because if you get in the habit of telling us about it, that habit will pay dividends over time, and everybody will benefit together. Angie Byron has a similar kind of a post where she says, just blog about it. I think I referenced it earlier, and there are links here in the presentation that if you want to go read the whole blog post. But the idea is the more people are just telling about what their own experiences are. We do have Google, which does this amazing job of filtering it, so don't worry about cluttering up the space, right? Google does a pretty good job of helping people find what they really need. I'm amazed sometimes at how they do. And the more of that's documented and out there, I think the better off we all are. Any comments on this? Questions? Anybody think, are there other ways that you can think of, sort of ways that you might contribute to documentation than like these, we've got the official documentation in code, issues, queues, third-party sites, Drupal Planet, write a book. Am I missing anything? This is my first draft at this slide and this presentation, and I think I'll be doing it again, so please let me know if I'm missing anything that I should add. Okay. I want to give you some more specific suggestions. We're talking a little bit in generalities, although I've been kind of specific, but let's get into drupal.org a little bit and look at, how are we doing for time? Because that clock is totally off.
3 minutes-ish.
Oh my gosh, we're almost done. So, I'm going to need to, boy, time flies when you're having fun. I am going to need to kind of skim through these quick, I think, because I just want you to see some of what's available. So let me browse through this pretty quickly. On Drupal.org, I've got arrows pointing to the community section and the getting involved. There's a whole getting involved section. And again, knowing that this stuff is here is going to help you find it. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide. I'm sorry. Thank you for waving at me. I can see two of them. You can't. So there's a community tab at the top there, and there's a getting involved section. And in that getting involved section is this green button. And I'm sure somebody made that green button to make it more visible, but every time I come to this page, I miss that green button. I look everywhere else but at that green button. So know that that green button is there. And that'll help you get to the getting involved section. There's a lot of good information in there. Again, it's hard, you know, I want to be constructive and offer ideas instead of just criticism, but it's hard to find when you're, if you're just sort of navigating Drupal.org. Once you get into that getting involved guide, here's kind of a blow up, so maybe you can read some of the kinds of pages that are out there. There's a whole section on contributor tasks. There's a section on contribute to documentation. There's a section on contribute to Drupal.org. Drupal.org has its own issues queue. If you have a complaint about how, in addition to the documentation issues queue, there's a Drupal.org issue queue. It's like, wow, when I found that out. You can actually go and make suggestions or help. There are actually tasks there that you can help work on. I got to go to my next slide. I keep looking ahead. Here's a close-up of more specific documentation tasks. We've got some more complicated things like contributing to Symfony documentation, but some of those here, there's a page on current documentation priorities, things that really need to be done right now that you can help with. That's separate from the issues queue. You can always go to the issue queue. Contributing to documentation FAQ, that's something I've helped edit quite a bit because I had a bunch of questions I couldn't find answers to. So once I got the answers, I went back to the contributing to documentation, contributing to documentation FAQ, and I asked and answered the question. So at least a few of those are for me. In the getting involved guide, and this is where Drupal.org gets, there's some documentation under specific documentation tasks. If you go to contributor tasks, there's a section called new contributor tasks, and the first one there is add keywords to a community documentation page. And if you go down some of those other new contributor tasks, first of all, maybe you don't want to do documentation, there's going to be some other ideas for you there as well, but there's at least a few documentation related tasks available there. And there's some nice pages, I've helped edit some of those that really describe and provide links to other resources. Once you find these pages, they're great. We just got to figure out how to expose them. Incorporating, I talked about this before, you could, as a really specific task you can do, incorporating the comments into the actual documentation and then having those comments removed. Respond to a documentation issue report. You can go into the documentation issues queue, and there is a link to that on the documentation page on Drupal.org. Did I duplicate that one? I got to. Anyways, adding keywords. Here is the documentation page. If you click on the upper tab, I started out, the last page I showed you is the community page. Right next to that is documentation. If you click on the documentation tab, you're going to see contribute to docs, which is going to take you to a page with a bunch of information on how to do that, to find out how you can help. And there's also number 3 there is the documentation issues queue. That's where you go to report an issue, to ask a question, to maybe get feedback. There is also a documentation group on groups.drupal.org. I didn't know that. I do now. There is also a Drupal.org group on groups.drupal.org. There's also a groups.drupal.org group on groups.drupal.org. So if you want to ask questions or find out what's going on, so these aren't really so much, I think, intended to be discussion places as they are places to post where announcements are posted. So for example, if I go back one, you'll see that the top thing is this month in documentation. The documentation working group tries to put out a report every month about sort of what they've been doing and what's happening and how you can be more involved. There is an IRC channel. I'm guessing from what I know about this group that not a lot of you are in IRC. How many are in IRC? Raise your hands. Pretty good, about 4 or 5, 6. Maybe almost half the group, at least sometimes in IRC. I go sometimes weeks without logging into IRC, but then another 3 weeks where I'm logged in every day, so it depends. But IRC is a place where the Drupal community communicates. There's lots of channels for specific topics. There's a documentation group. There's also a drupal.org group. So any of those things you want to talk about, you can find an IRC channel. And all of those people were logged in today when I took the screenshot to the documentation group. So there are people there to answer your questions. I'm actually almost done. My own view, some of the major challenges for for documentation in Drupal.org, or documentation in general, is one, the technology. I've complained a bit about that today, but I do think people are working towards solutions, and we can all be part of that and give feedback and help find those solutions. The lack of attention put on documentation at sprints. You know, many of us come to these sprints and want to do documentation, and there's not always somebody there. At DrupalCon, if you go to the big sprint day, there'll be a whole group of people working on documentation. In Amsterdam, I spent a little bit of time with a table of folks working on documentation there. But if you're going to some camp, it's much less likely that anybody will be working on that. But feel free to step up and say, hey, that's what I want to do, and just start doing it and help others. I also find, and this is sort of a general challenge, I think, about getting people involved in Drupal at all, is the emphasis on the cutting edge stuff, the Drupal 8, solving the big problems, right? And they really want to get people focused on that, and I understand it, but it leaves a lot of us what we know about Drupal is Drupal 7. And I think providing more opportunities for us to contribute where we have our knowledge and feel confident would be helpful. A couple of, I'll post these slides on the website and tweet about them. There are a couple of the links that I shared in the slides. And my last is a shameless plug for the Twin Cities Drupal Camp, which I'm helping to organize. Any of you from this region who want to go to another great camp in the end of June, we're there. So we are out of time. Somebody just opened the door. I'm willing to take, we're only a minute over, so we could probably take a question or a comment. Anybody have anything to share? Anybody inspired to go out and edit a document tonight? Yeah. Okay, please do. Please look me up. I want to give this presentation again. Let me know how I can improve it. And I'm happy to stick around and talk about what I've learned along the way. And if there's things that I didn't mention that you think belong in here, come and tell me about it so that I can include those. Okay? Thanks, everyone.